Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. My name is Robert Loubser. I am with the Smarter Urban Rural SIG, and I want to welcome you all to our webinar this afternoon or this evening or this morning, depending on where you are. We've got, you're with the Smarter Urban Rural SIG, as I said. We've got a webinar for you today. I want to just remind you, if you have questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom there. We're going to collate all of your questions, and at the end, we'll have a session with our guest, and we're going to answer all of your questions. So please do post your questions as we go along, and we'll get back to you at the end. Okay, so what are special interest groups? Special interest groups are exploration areas within the IPMA where we look at specific focus areas. We try to advance the industry, create new standards, and network with industry leaders. So you're with us today with the Smarter Urban Rural SIG. We look at smart cities, smart rural solutions, and we focus on how we can integrate technology into our cities to have smarter working environments, smarter living conditions. So the other SIGs that you've got there is the AI SIG, the healthcare, innovation and change, mega projects, business agility, energy, diversity, equity, inclusion, PMO, environmental, social, government, water, smarter university, and the software. Go to sig.ipma.world to get information on these SIGs. What you'll also find is that this session is recorded, so we will post this on our website. So anyone that you know that might have missed this one, they can go and get it on the website. Previous webinars that we've had, you'll find them there as well. So please go there and have a look. Some good webinars we've had over the last couple of years. All right. So today we've got Apu Wevela with us. He is a senior scientist with a VTT Technical Research of Finland. His research focuses on impact evaluation of climate neutral, sustainable, and smart cities. His 15 years of research experience in developing indicator frameworks to help cities set meaningful targets and to optimize resource use and assess the impacts of urban solutions. Apu's work has been published in leading journals in the field and has been cited over 3,500 times. I also want to introduce my co-host here, Vanessa. She's also on the Smarter Urban and Rural SIG, and Vanessa is going to join us today, and she's going to do the Q&A with us. And our colleague Ben Peters, he's the lead of the Smarter Urban Rural SIG. Thank you for joining us. We're going to have badges available, and please do the survey afterwards, and you can get you'll get your CPD badges afterwards. I'm going to hand over now to Apu. Apu, if you could just share your screen for us, and the stage is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Robert and Vanessa, for the invitation. Nice to be here with you. I will share my screen. Can you see now in the presentation mode?
Yes, we can see your screen. Thank you.
Great. So yeah, nice to be here with you. And I will be telling about the research we are doing on climate neutral and smart cities in Europe. So yeah, I'm representing the VTT, the Technical Research Center of Finland, and we have various collaboration across different actors in Europe. So this has been a major topic in Europe, and I will be a bit telling like what are the agendas in Europe related to this topic, and what are the achievements until now, different challenges and solutions as well. So yeah. First of all, as a background, why carbon neutrality is an important goal. You have all heard of Paris Agreement and also several like IPCC reports mentioning this 1.5 temperature rise in global warming as an important limit to avoid most severe impacts on climate change, like extreme weather events, sea level rise, loss of biodiversity, and so on. So this goal, to achieve this goal, we need to become carbon neutral by 2050. So after these goals, there have been like many different countries, cities, also continents setting different carbon neutrality goals. In EU, we have now the climate law setting the legally binding goal of climate neutrality by 2050. China has its goal of 2060 for climate neutrality, US 2050. Then in Finland, we have 2035 carbon neutrality goal, and then some cities has even much more ambitious carbon neutrality goals, like Copenhagen at 2025. So actually this year they are not reaching it, but there have been many really ambitious goals. In EU, we also have a mission. So some of these goals are, fortunately, they are legally binding, like the EU climate law, and also in Finland we have this carbon neutrality goal as part of the climate change law. But much more is needed, and we often then this type of change requires really harsh decisions, and they are quite difficult to pass through in the politics. We have seen this in Finland, for example. So here we can see a bit like the how radical the change should be. So on top in the figure, you are seeing like the path if we make some only incremental change, like the according to current policies. And if we want to achieve these goals that we are having in Europe, we should be on the path like in the below. So cities have become really important players in climate action. So here are many statistics that all of you, I think, know. So why cities are important? Of course, the urbanization is very quick, and in Europe already 75% is living in urban areas. And while cities occupy only 2-3% of the land surface, they percentage of the emissions and waste. But there are many opportunities as well. So actually, cities they provide an optimal scale, cities and districts, to implement these high-level political goals into practice. So that they provide the right scale to implement this in practice corresponding to the end user needs. And then, of course, most of the innovations take place in cities. The big companies are there, so there is also the possibility to create these innovations that are needed to achieve this really quick, radical systemic change. And yeah, cities are also like the most efficient urban form to produce services, like from the ecological perspective, especially if we think like on mobility, transportation, for example. Next, I will go to the topic of carbon neutrality, how it's defined, what it means, and different challenges and implications in how it's being currently interpreted in research. So the basic idea of carbon neutral city is that there is an equal amount of emissions in city consumed and removed over a certain time, typically 1 year. In practice, it doesn't yet mean that all the emissions are cut to zero, but it allows for some part of the emissions to be compensated through offsetting, and there are different means. But basically, the first step is to minimize the emissions caused in the city, then removing remaining emissions through carbon sinks, such as forests, soils, and oceans. And then there are some technologies like carbon capture and storage technologies also for carbon removal. And quite typically in the political documents, it's allowed to compensate up to 20% of the emissions currently from through green projects that the city initiates, but that are not necessarily in the city within the city boundaries. But when we look at the methods of calculating these emissions and reporting them currently, there are many challenges. How the city boundaries are defined, it's not always evident, and the approaches are not the same in different countries. Currently, there is also a lot of confusion in the terminology, what we mean by carbon neutral, climate neutral, or net zero city. Sometimes these terms are used interchangeably. And also sometimes like the scope, do we count only like CO2 emissions or also other greenhouse gases? And then one really important point from the methodological perspective is like, do we account the city emissions based on where they are produced or based on where the emissions are consumed? So do we look at within the city boundaries, the emissions that are produced within the city boundaries, or do we analyze like from the perspective of what is consumed in the city regardless of its location of production? So this, of course, affects a lot the results that we achieve. Then also there are differences on which sectors we include in the calculation, and also then these methods of offsetting or compensating emissions, with sometimes some issues of double accounting emissions. In practice, currently cities' carbon accounting methods are not consistent due to these challenges, and the carbon neutrality targets also are not comparable. But there are many initiatives which provide like common reporting methods for cities. So we are in progress of achieving more like comparability in the results as well. Of course, transparency is really important to then explain openly what are the hypotheses like behind the calculations. So this is one way to explain the scope of emissions, very typical in the company reporting, so the emission scopes. So scope 1 means like in the case of the city, like what are the emissions that are produced within the city boundaries. Then the scope 2, it includes also like electricity that is transferred to the city through grid supplied lines. And then scope 3 is then like emissions that are indirectly caused by the city and produced elsewhere. So typically cities, they report this scope 1 and 2 emissions. So it's this production-based approach. So looking at like where the emissions are produced. So if they are within the city boundary, then they are included in the calculation. And then currently, typically these scope 3 emissions, so they are excluded. But there is a trend to also report these scope 3 emissions. And there are many like philosophical questions that also like in the Paris Agreement, the approach is based on the location where the emissions are produced. But currently there is a lot of import and export between countries. So if, for example, products are produced in China and then we buy them in Finland, then those emissions caused by the production of those goods are counted in China's emission. And of course, there are differences in between countries and cities, like if they're relying more on imports or exports. And this creates like different interests also for cities or countries to choose one of these approach. So consumption or production based accounting. And then cities are piloting this scope 3 emission calculation, so this indirect emissions and also like this consumption based emissions. Then we need to be really open that if one city has included this emission in its accounting, it's not compared to another city emissions that includes only scope 1 or 2 emissions, because this scope 3 emissions can be up to 90% of total emissions. Next, I will be telling about this EU mission of 100 climate neutral and smart cities by 2030. So this is a large EU initiative where we have been part of with many other organizations. And there was a process to select 100 cities from Europe and then 12 cities from associated countries to be part of this mission. And we are part of this Net Zero Cities initiative that helps these 112 cities to achieve this really ambitious target. So this Net Zero Cities initiative is managing this mission and providing different types of tools and support to these cities to achieve this climate neutrality goal by 2030. So this mission, it's in, of course, like it allows to really develop these really radical solutions that are needed for the climate neutrality. So this allows to have experimentation and innovation in these 100 cities, and we try to find like the solutions that could allow the other cities in Europe also to achieve climate neutrality on time. So this Net Zero Cities project, so it has many different types of supports for these cities. Also like developing capabilities of the city and ways of working to achieve the systemic change. And then we have a platform with many different tools, also like a lot of services and expertise to support cities. And here is like a bit about the systems change that is needed. So what is often what has been happening in cities. So they work in different departments that can be quite fragmented, and there is no like overall communication between departments is not so well always managed, and it's really important to create this synergies and collaboration between the different parts of the organization, because this climate neutrality target touches all, and also like these different domains like energy, mobility, they're interlinked. So this is one thing that is really needed, is this deep collaboration also then with all the other stakeholders within the city. So here is the different things that we are doing. and where we are supporting cities and where we encourage the steps that we encourage cities to take. So first, in these 112 cities, the idea is to develop a transition team to implement this and coordinate this change towards climate neutrality. So this includes like actors from the city department, from the different parts of the organization, and then also like companies, um, citizen associations, and there is this multi-stakeholder team that is needed to make this change happen. Then we built the climate transition map. We have city advisors to support cities to develop this plan. And then there are different city learning programs where we provide like build the capacities of the city personnel. And then in the Net Zero Cities portal, there are various tools and services that can help to implement the change and evaluate the impacts and so on. And then there is one central tool called Climate City Contract. I will tell more about that later on, which is really important part of this path to climate neutrality by 2030. Then we have different pilot cities programs and also like twinning programs between different cities. So this climate city contract, this is a public roadmap to climate neutrality by 2030. So publicly shared and validated also by the European Commission. So it's kind of a public commitment to this goal and also like an explanation of how the city will achieve this climate neutrality goal by 2030. So this climate city contract, it's composed of three different documents. Commitment document, which explains the different targets that the city has in relation to the climate neutrality by 2030. And it's signed by multiple stakeholders. So essentially this city transition team. So like all the key stakeholders, city mayor, different main departments in the city, and then also like companies, and then some citizen associations and so on. Then the second part in this climate city contract is the action plan. So it explains like it has a different calculations like to explain like where the city is currently with regard to its emissions. Then what are the concrete actions that it commits to implement to achieve climate neutrality by 2030. And then also like calculations, how this will impact the goal and what are the different steps in implementing these actions and so on. Basically, it explains the concrete actions to achieve climate neutrality by 2030. And the third part is this investment plan. So then it looks from the financial perspective, like what is financially required by the actions to achieve climate neutrality, and the plan to where to find these funds, this money for implementing the action plan. So I will look at more in detail at each of these three parts. So for the commitment document, it's composed of the key stakeholders. So it builds the strong mandates for the climate neutrality goal. And of course, to do that, the city needs to create a city transition team. So including key stakeholders within the local ecosystem and within the city government and companies. Then to achieve the goal, this is really crucial to have this deep collaboration. So this is what we are building in these first steps here. So among different stakeholders that are required. So it's of course like the city organization, municipality is important, but it cannot directly impact many of the emissions. So according to case studies, like up to 30% of emissions are under the city's jurisdiction, but then the companies, citizens are needed, and then also a large share of the emissions, they are dependent on the national decisions. So, or the emissions of the national energy grids, for example. So there is also it requires like close collaboration at different levels, like at regional level and then national level as well. But a city, it often owns like big part of the land within its in city, and therefore it has really important role like as an enabler and catalyst of change, and also like it can initiate the change and bring together all the key players within the local ecosystem. So next, this second part, maybe the most important part in the climate city contracts, it's the action plan. So it analyzes like the existing strategies, policies, and plans, and then it creates this portfolio of different interventions, actions to achieve the 2030 carbon neutrality goal. So it builds on existing strategies, but then defines the future actions and processes that are needed. These are backed up by the data-driven analysis and calculations of the emissions and so on. And then it's also linked to the third part, which is the investment plan. So then the investment plan, it looks on the financial part, financial private investment and public funds that are needed to implement the interventions that the city has identified as necessary to achieve its climate neutrality goal. So it's aligned with the actions that are included in the action plan, and then focuses on this financial planning. So of course it also requires inputs from multiple stakeholders. So in summary, again, here is the multiple integrations between the city and the experts in the Net Zero Cities consortium. So if you are interested, you can have a look at the tools and resources available there. They can be relevant for anything related to climate neutrality at city level. Then I looked a bit like what is what is happening currently in the academic research, what are the trends in the research on this topic, like climate neutrality in cities. So So of course, climate neutrality was and carbon neutrality were part of the search terms here. So that's why they are highlighted in the word cloud. But really, energy transition is a central part. Also, greenhouse gas capture, emission capture, storage, carbon sequestration methods, mobility. Also, smart city is mentioned here, and of course, smart city was also part of this EU initiative. So then I looked also like with wider search terms, what is happening in what are the key trends in the research, and and here, of course, the smart city solutions, they are seen as enablers to make happen these radical changes that are needed for climate neutrality and sustainable urban transition in general. And this is based on almost 3,000 articles over the past 2 years. So here we can see, of course, mobility is a very important topic. Um, Digital twins are gaining, machine learning are gaining more and more importance. Internet of Things, intelligent transportation, and so on. Cybersecurity also mentioned there. Then, well, somehow my personal expertise is then related to how to evaluate the impacts in city, and this was like in the net zero cities, how we look at this city transition and how to evaluate it. So there this theory of change was used. So we have like different emission domains and systemic levers on left hand side, and then we define like on a different time scale, like the early changes, later outcomes, and then long-term impacts on the right-hand side. So analyzing also direct benefits and co-benefits. And then below in the figure, you can see that we define indicators for these different steps in the so-called impact pathway. So we have indicators for these early changes to measure them, also then indicators to evaluate the later outcomes, and then also indicators to evaluate the long-term impact. So all these different steps are important to evaluate in the process when we are evaluating the city transformation. Because quite often, if we look at sustainability indicators, for example, there is a high focus on impact indicators. But then if we want to really see what are the impacts of our actions that we are implementing, if we look at these impact indicators, as we see in this slide, often the impact can be realized really slowly, like after 5 years, for example. So that's why we need like also indicators to really give direct feedback in the short term at different steps. So for that, like in line with this theory of change and the city transformation process, like what's been what I have advocated for, like in my research, is this typology of indicators of inputs related to inputs, process, output, outcome, and impact. So they correspond in the different steps in the city transformation process. And then in relation to this also, I have developed the indicator selection process because at the end, each city is different. They have different targets, different strategies, different contexts where they're operating. So there are thousands of indicator frameworks available for cities to evaluate their impacts, but then at the end, cities still need to select their own ones to some extent to assess the progress towards their own strategic targets. So here the first step is really to look with the city, like what are the strategic goals, and then select the indicators like based on the conceptual focus that aligns like with this city strategic goals. Then the second step is to define the purpose of evaluation. So considering also the phase of city development that is being evaluated and different reporting expectations and format requirements. So then the indicator types that I mentioned before, indicators should be selected by the types that correspond to this purpose of evaluation. Then the scope of evaluation, defining really what are we evaluating, what are the objects of evaluation, and then the indicators, functional units, and assessment methods need to be selected accordingly. And last, look with the city like what is the availability of data and resources, and then this affects like the selection of the final indicators and assessment methods so that they are really feasible, and then of course they need to also comply with certain quality criteria. So thank you very much. This was my presentation. So I will stop sharing and then have to pass it over you.
Thank you very much, Apple. Okay. Rob, can I start?
Yes, thank you very much, Apple. Interesting webinar. Let's get into the Q&A. Vanessa, let's have a look. I can see there's a bit of chat going on there. Harry, I see your hand was up. Do you want to post in the chat on the
I'm having some trouble because I cannot see the Q&A.
Q&A for us? The question you've had, what we're doing from your side, that we can keep going here.
I will start with my questions. So I'm familiar with your research, you know that. We have met before. And I had some questions in my mind, but you've been answering during your presentation, so I'm improvising here. Okay. You talk about several challenges for the cities to achieve this climate neutrality in Europe specifically, but do you have a top 3 challenge or something like that? Can you just mention the key challenge that we need to achieve?
Yeah, I think that technologies required for these really ambitious goals, they are there already. So that's not really the issue, but then really main obstacle is to really to build the capabilities, and then also like make the difficult political local decisions that, for example, I can give some examples that from my home city, like in Helsinki. If we have this really ambitious goals here, so at national level, it's maybe the most ambitious in the world. That I think that in the Western countries, that is part of the legislation. But then in practice, what we need to do, we need to make like cut the emissions for mobility, for example. So in Helsinki, if we need to have some tolls for the cars, or we need to forbid like the use of cars in the city center, and some of these decisions, they are really necessary if we want to cut the emissions. So and follow the path to the goal, and then at the end there is too much like opposition in the political parties. Then most of them, they are not ready to make these decisions, and also like citizens. So then these harsh decisions, they at the end they come to these political decisions that are sometimes very difficult to implement.
So the political decisions are key, and I think that makes the local and the national legislation linked with the European legislation. So it's kind of a complicated there.
Yeah. The political leadership like that the cities are having, that's really important and really good. But then these really concrete decisions, sometimes they are really difficult to pass through.
Okay, and can we point Helsinki as one of the successful cities implementing some of these measurements for the transition? Is there any other city that we can point out in Europe? You know them, you know a lot of them. So you mentioned Copenhagen that it has a great challenge, but in terms of implementation.
Yeah, well, yeah, Copenhagen is of course foreign like in this using wind energy, and they have really been a forerunners in renewable energy in many ways. In Helsinki, of course, we had the important decisions to forbid like the use of coal, and we also use open data quite much to support this transition. I think it is a bit different case, and in the EU mission we have this example of 112 cities that each of them are forerunner in one way or another. Each city is different.
You clearly state that each city is different, so the indicators to measure the transition is reasonable that they are different. But when you're looking to decide which proposals can help your city, I think it's interesting to see how other cities work and to see what is working in other cities. So I guess that it has to be something that we can compare. It has to be a set of, I don't know, just a few indicators that we can measure in each city and help us not, I don't know, it's just a slight comparison to say, okay, this city is similar to mine, so I can go for this. Which indicators can we use for that?
Yeah, I totally agree. Like it's important to have a core set of indicators that are common for cities, and then some other indicators that are locally selected. So of course, like we have this some of the indicators that are really for sure like important for also like these different types of emissions, for example, like carbon emissions, then the air quality related indicators, and so on, and of course like there are many city initiatives where cities are collaborating, and they can I totally agree that they can learn a lot from each other in many ways, and they are already like collaborating really nicely, I think, like on a voluntary basis in many countries and between the countries.
I guess those outcomes, we need to relate them to maybe the population, the size of the city, the incomes, and here it comes a question we have from Ben Peters. You must know that he's not in Europe. So he's asking, what role does cultural context play in shaping how different cities approach carbon neutrality? So I guess here we have another thing that we have to pitch in. How does cultural context influence these processes? What's your idea about it?
Cultural context. So, yeah, I'm not sure if I'm interpreting the question in the right way, but of course, in different parts of the world, in different cities, the values are different and the priorities are different. So, of course, the importance given to climate neutrality, it's much higher in some cities, some countries than some others. So this also, of course, has a really big impact on the decisions that can be made. And if climate neutrality is not considered important within the local context, then it would be really difficult also to implement the changes required by that. So it has a big importance, of course.
Yeah, thanks, Apu. I've actually got a follow-up on that, which is related in a way. It is at some point cities need to make decisions. So there's sort of a prioritization that plays in on investment decisions, and I enjoyed your slides on the decisions, the process and the decisions framework. How does that, in your mind, and this sort of links up with Ben's question, um, how does that relate? So the prioritization and the decisions, the climate neutral approach of a city is something that is that can come at a premium. How do you balance that with other needs? And is that something that you've come across in your work and in your research work, and how that is approached?
Yeah, that's really important. Like I would say, like the interrelations between different targets. So if we look at the environmental aspects, for example, then there is this. Well, let's say that actions that improve our development towards climate neutrality, they support also like the reduction of biodiversity loss in principle, but the city can have different strategies related to biodiversity and climate neutrality, for example. And of course, we need to always analyze the trade-off. But then it's of course what is more practical, maybe more happening, is then looking at the financial choices that are needed to make the most environmentally friendly choice. So of course, the climate friendly technologies, they can be often more expensive. So one way the state can, of course, support the environmental friendly choice. Somehow there are many ways, like in Europe, that, for example, e-vehicles, there have been different monetary supports to buy them in. So and also like for wind power, first it was supported. For example, in Finland, it was first supported financially, and then it became actually the most economically the best choice. So now the support has been stopped. So to really start the wider implementation of these new technologies, often it requires some support in the beginning. But that's within the when we are really evaluating the impacts of different actions in cities. That's really important to really analyze like the interrelations between the different types of impacts. So of course, like I mentioned, also like different things we are doing related to land use, mobility, buildings, energy. They are related. So it requires somehow holistic approach to analyze the trade-offs.
Yes, I guess it's not easy to have a general framework for every city in every place. It's not easy, even inside Europe. It cannot be easy at the whole world. The challenge is the same. So we agree that the climate change is a challenge for all the world, for all the population, but focusing on the measurements, how to apply it, and which things to foster in each part of the world is not that easy. Yeah, that's true. Okay, I don't think we have any more questions, Robert.
Are
If
we
you
out
can
of
see.
questions? Okay, well,
Yeah.
it looks like we're up on the hour as well. So I just want to thank Afu for joining us here today. Thank you for taking us through your work and your research. Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Ben, for joining us here today. And thank you for everyone who is dialed in from wherever you are in the world. I'm going to sign off. Just remember, there's a survey that'll come after this. Please fill in the survey so we know where we can be better and what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong. And we see you at the next one. Thank you very much. Have a good day.